the greatest indication of recovery is performance. And so am I consistently performing, and that means ability to progress at stuff. And so if we were to take a hypothetical of a person who lifts, who wants to do some cardio, how do they know they're doing too much? And it's like, if you start showing up to your lifts and you can't progress and you start to regress, and I don't just mean as a one-off, by the way, that shit happens. You have a day, something didn't progress, you matched last week, no worries. I'm talking about a trend of regression.
Wits and Weights community, welcome to another episode of the Wits and Weights podcast. Today, I'm excited to be joined by personal trainer, ex-gym owner, and MNU certified nutritionist Jordan Lips, who works exclusively online with people who want to get healthier across a broad range of goals. Now, I invited Jordan on the show because not only do I follow his podcast, it's called Where Optimal Meets Practical, so make sure to follow that, but I really appreciate his straight up approach. The way that he communicates topics like metabolism and building muscle that often get misconstrued or at least overcomplicated by the fitness industry. And Jordan just tells it like it is. So today we're going to have him drop his expertise in three big areas that we're hearing a lot about: time efficient hypertrophy, so how to save time while getting jacked, incorporating cardio as a lifter, and clearing up some of the misconceptions about metabolic adaptation. Now, Jordan has over 15 years of experience as the mind behind Jordan Lips Fitness, and he offers both one-on-one and group coaching. His online group programs, including the hypertrophies for the gym and home bodies for those working out from home, are designed to respect your time and lifestyle. And it doesn't hurt that he has a deep understanding of biomechanics, nutrition, and individualized program design. Now, I also mentioned his podcast already, Where Optimal Meets Practical, and that is exactly what it sounds like: optimizing your training, nutrition, and mindset, but doing so in a practical, accessible way. So definitely give Jordan's show a follow if today's conversation resonates with you, which I know it will. Jordan, man, thank you so much for coming on Wits and Weights.
Now that is an intro. Thanks, man. I appreciate you having me.
Yeah, man, I was very excited for this because, again, I follow your stuff and I heard you on a few other podcasts recently and wanted to dive into the hot topics, right? And one of those, and we'll get into your story and real world kind of interaction as we go along, but time efficient hypertrophy. We've got a lot of folks listening who are, maybe they're in their 40s like me. I'm a dad. We're busy. We have obligations. We're not looking to compete, but we all are looking to look our best and have this sort of fitness lifestyle. How do we design that lifestyle? We can get into details as we go along, but what's your general approach to that?
I think the first thing that comes to mind to me when I'm thinking about people who are interested in efficiency is just kind of taking a small step back and acknowledging and maybe just shifting people's expectations of how much they need to do in the first place. And so I think people who are interested in efficiency, I think those are the same people that would benefit from understanding actually how little you need to do and to make gains, let's say. And the truth is that every time we look into this, the bar gets lower and lower, specifically for strength, but also for hypertrophy. We don't need to go into super specifics here, but there are people out there that are like trying to train 5-6 days a week, 4, 5, 6 days a week that could also see gains from 3 days a week. So when we're talking about time efficient hypertrophy, I think the first thing to understand is, a lot of people probably don't have to do as much as you think in terms of time allocation. If you do some of the stuff that we're going to talk about today, you can shrink the time allocation from a weekly perspective more and more and more, the more knobs you turn in your favor in this regard. So I do think that the first thing people are like, oh, I want to be more efficient. And they're like, well, I train 6 days a week. I'm like, well, for starters, you could just do what you're already doing like 3 to 4 days a week, and you'd still also make gains. And so just first understanding that and kind of just maybe calming down some of those expectations of, oh, I have to do a whole lot to see any progress whatsoever. That is the first thing that comes to mind for sure.
Yeah, fair enough. And it's kind of like this false alternative people have of like, I either have to do all this training and frequency and days per week, or I'm just not going to work out because, there's no middle ground to get the 80-90% that I'm looking for. And yeah, I've had a lot of clients who come in just doing way too much. And it's usually it's like not an obsession, but they just love going to the gym or they love doing stuff and they feel like if they don't, they're just going to lose everything. So let's talk about some of the specific techniques. We can start with maybe how can a beginner or intermediate lifter, spend as little time as possible just to get great gains to begin with?
Yeah, you want to, I'll say it in a way that might sound complicated, but then we'll break it down, is you want to maximize your per set stimulus. Right? If we use the number of sets I'm doing as just a proxy for how much time I'm in the gym, we want each of those sets that we're doing to be maximally stimulative. So what are the things we can do to make each set more beneficial so that we don't have to do as many of them? And the biggest one by far is going closer to failure. The closer you are to failure, the more you get on that, the more stimulus you get from that set, the less of those you'd have to do to kind of amass an amount of stimulus that you'd need to make gains over time. Now that there's a smidge of nuance to that, but I think on average, if we're talking, hey, I don't have a lot of time, I want to make gains, guess what? We're training on average harder. That is the biggest, the most important one, by far the most. Everything we talk about today is secondary to taking your sets close to failure. If you're somebody looking to save time, you want to get the most stimulus per set. The best way to do that is to train freaking hard and to go close to beyond failure, depending on the context. And so don't leave intensity on the table would be the biggest one for sure.
Yeah, I love that. And we were joking about, Brian Borstein was recently on the show. We got into all the nuances of intensity techniques and things like that. But just at the principled level here, training hard, how do we reconcile that with the volume and the frequency of that hard? So, people are asking, well, what does that mean? Does that mean do I do the compound lifts and then I go toward failure? Do I, how many days per week? Like, we want to go to that next level, right?
Sure. If we want, I can list out what I would do if I was speaking with someone whose goal is efficiency, and we can pick apart any of them that we'd like. I think for starters, remind people that they probably need less than they think if they do these things. Number two would be the most important thing is going closer to failure. Then the utilization of intensity techniques like drop sets, myo reps, shorter rest periods in general, which we can talk about, supersetting, lengthened partials. On average, use more compound lifts. On average, train more in the length and position of a muscle, use exercises that provide more stability, and potentially utilize lower rep ranges. If you do all of those things, your program will get a lot of stimulus per time, and you won't have to spend as much time doing it.
So you mentioned intensity techniques, more compound lifts. That makes a lot of sense, right? You're using more muscle mass for fewer movements and less time. Training more in the length and position. Stability, I want to dive into that one a bit. And then you said lower rep ranges, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, of course. Stability. Expound on that one.
Yeah, the less work your body and other muscles have to do to stabilize, the more output you can get at the target muscle. And so if we look at something like a back squat versus a hack squat takes care of a lot of the stability. You're moving on a fixed path. You don't need to stabilize the hips. The machine's doing all that for you. And so you're able to get greater output in the quads. There's that exercises. We could do more stability / less technical, less coordination heavy. And so the more, listen, I think free weights are amazing. This isn't like an anti-free weights thing, but on average, if I can find a really great machine option or a really great cable option, chances are I can get greater output there because I'm going to be provided the stability that normally I'd have to create internally. And so when it comes to rows, let's get a chest support. When it comes to squats, hack squat, leg press, leg extension, more controlled environments, less technique heavy, less coordination requirement, less stability requirement. You'll get greater output at the muscle per set. It doesn't mean, remember, we're talking about a spectrum. We're talking about skewing things on average. We're not talking about I wouldn't say only compound. I wouldn't say only lengthened. I wouldn't say only mega high stability, perfect scenario stuff. But on average, if you're like, hey, I'm writing my program, I have a hack squat or should I do a back squat? I only get one squat pattern for my quads. It's like, the at least appeal to what would be more optimal for your quads, you'd go with the hack squat because of the additional stability, because of the fact that you don't need to use hips and glutes as much.
Yeah, and I totally agree. And honestly, in my personal experience lately, running some bodybuilding type training, mainly to manage fatigue for me, being that I've had low back fatigue and doing a lot of the big lifts for so long, I definitely get it. The counter argument people might make is, well, with a squat, you're working out so many different muscle groups. And yes, stability is part of that. That's actually by definition part of it. So why isn't that more efficient than breaking it up? Now I have to do 4 different movements.
Yeah, that is fair. If you're going to say, well, if I'm going to do a hack squat that's hyper biased towards the quads, or I'm going to only back squat and I'm going to make it kind of I say annoying term because people aren't using it, but the term that we were taught was omni, just meaning like covers many bases, covers more than one thing. And I'm just squatting to squat and we're getting a decent adductor stimulus, decent quad stimulus, decent glute stimulus. Yes, if I only get one lower body movement, it wouldn't be a hack squat. It would be a balanced, it might be a hack squat with a higher foot position where I engage a little bit more glutes. It wouldn't be something hyper specific from a bias perspective, but I would still pick something with more stability. I mean, if I only get one lower body, let's say lengthened position movement, it's going to be a leg press or a high foot hack squat, let's say, still with the stability, but I just wouldn't bias towards one thing too
Mhm.
much. And not that I don't know where your listeners are on the spectrum of like terminology, but like there's no such thing as like a stabilizing muscle. And when we're just talking about muscle growth, having to expend extra energy stabilizing or engaging the core, when we're just talking about muscle growth, those are negatives. Those are energy leaks. Those are things that you're doing that are going to take away from ultimately bringing the target muscle close to failure. Too much, I need to brace my core. I need to think about what my core is doing. I need to make sure my technique doesn't break down. I mean, 99.999% of people are going to stop an RDL or a back squat because of a technique breakdown or core demands or breathing demands or lower back fatigue. Notice how none of those things had to do with lower body musculature. But if I ask you why you stopped doing a leg extension, it's because your quads hurt, and that's it. And so the goal for hypertrophy is to take the target muscle or muscles close to failure, not something else. And the amount of precision that you need to target one muscle at a time becomes greater the more advanced you get, becomes more general when you're just starting out. And so that definitely is another piece of context of where people are in the journey. But it doesn't change all that much. I think at the end of the day, we are looking for on average more stability, on average more output, on average closer to failure to get a bit more bang for the buck.
So this concept of stimulus fatigue ratio, you're basically saying the denominator, denominator, the fatigue is what we're trying to minimize here through this process and eliminate the leaks, eliminate the, I'll even say psychological effort, right? With some of these high technique lifts, all of it compounds into fatigue that doesn't translate directly into our goal, which is to build muscle.
Not
What
to not to
about,
not to
yeah,
hold on,
sorry.
not to not
Yeah,
to
yeah.
not to nitpick that at all because
Okay.
you're 100%
Yeah.
right,
You can,
100% right.
you can nitpick it though.
Those are all better
Yeah.
SFR. Those are all appeals to SFR to make
Yeah.
that ratio better. But what's interesting is if we're talking about efficiency, and I don't want to take it to the extreme in the sense of a full-blown minimalist. But what's interesting about efficiency when you're training with someone who's, hey, I'm looking for time efficiency, is if you look at SFR, the F really doesn't matter that much because it's unlikely that in 3 to 4 days of lifting, unless they're really long workouts, which again kind of goes against the efficiency thing, it's unlikely that you're going to run into a fatigue endpoint. And what I mean by that is like it's more about maximizing the per set stimulus. When we talk about maybe adding in cardio and all of a sudden somebody's doing a lot of training, lifting and cardio, that overall fatigue is certainly something we need to focus on. But like not to be, again, everything is nuance, everything is context. But if I have somebody training 3 days a week, there's just 3 days a week, 60 minutes. Let's put a cap on it. There's just nothing they could do in 180 minutes per week that I'm worried about them overtraining, unless they're in a huge deficit and a death in the family and they got laid off and unless you have a ton of extra life stress. I'm less concerned with the F part of that equation. And I'm more concerned with the S part of that equation because I just don't think, you're going to sooner run into an issue of I'm not progressing because my stimulus isn't high enough than I'm not progressing because my fatigue's too high.
Totally fair point, right? And maybe the fatigue comes in when you're violating the whole premise here, which is you're not being efficient and you're using too much volume. Also, intermediate or advanced lifters who are maybe, incorporating big lifts or things like that. Like that's where I come from sometimes. What about the rank beginner who, we talk about a lot of times here, just maybe focus on strength and compound lifts initially because they're simple, they're effective, you recover fast as a beginner. But I know there's some counterpoints to that when your goal is specifically to build muscle. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think the truth is that the things that are better for building muscle are better for building muscle for everyone all the time. And it's like saying, oh, do beginners need to be in a calorie surplus? It's like they'll build muscle just a lot faster, just like everyone else does in a surplus. So I agree with your initial statement of like, well, I agree with the sentiment from your initial statement was that if these things matter less, they matter less because no matter what someone does, it's above the minimum effective threshold for growth. It's like, if you're just starting to learn a language, go grab Duolingo or something on your phone and like you'll be infinitely better than you are today in a week. But that's still not a great tool if you want to be fluent. And that might not matter in the first week in the first month, but at some point you're like, oh, this tool is no longer taking me further. I need something else. And so in the beginning, anything is enough for you to grow. And so these nuances, they certainly matter less, but they're applied equally. So like if I have a rank of beginners, like I want to grow muscle as optimally as possible. It's like great, like or as efficiently as possible. I'm like great, let's use the leg press. And if we, that person still has, let's use 3 by 60 minutes as just like a rough proxy for someone who's trying to train efficiently. I'm going to use that person's 880 minutes a week the same way. It just they can lose less sleep over whether or not they've been doing something else for a while. A lot of people that come into the hypertrophy space, they discover that as a term and they're like, oh my God, I need to be only doing these high stability machines. And it's like, okay, like you're probably not, you probably haven't left a ton of gains, or you at very least have been gaining just fine without this stuff for a very, very long time. And so the principles all still apply in a relative sense, where like a beginner will still grow way better in a surplus. A beginner will still grow better with the same things that, Arnold would be growing better with. But it just matters less in the sense of you can probably make gains that you're satisfied with without worrying about it so much.
Okay, yeah, and to be even more specific, where I was going with that is the idea that there has to be some foundation of strength to really push the hypertrophy movements. And I know there's a little bit of an assumption there that's flawed, maybe, but that's the argument that's made, right?
Yeah, it's so funny that you're saying that. Is that I have a man? It's we're just going to take a small. I'm going to derail us for just 1 second.
It's all good.
And I have a clip from the Mind Pump guys basically making this, like, just want to talk about this. And so I have a clip of the Mind Pump guys basically saying like the best thing you can do for muscle growth is like spend a lot of years getting strong. It's just like literally makes no sense at all, as if they're two totally different things, as if you're not getting stronger doing hypertrophy, as if there's some base of strength that potentiates greater hypertrophy later. It doesn't. And I'll derail this again, that they just had Dave Asprey on the podcast, and I kind of went off in the comment section, and there's like 900 notifications of people ripping me apart in there, which is hysterical, but I don't know where they're going with that. But anyway, this idea that you need a strength base is just like, it's more of this like romanticized thing from like old the old 70s and 80s of like
Powerlifters, yeah.
clanging and banging the weights around before you can get into the nitty gritty. It's just not true at all. Like, you know, there's hypertrophy and strength in the beginning are they're the overlap. Imagine a Venn diagram. The overlap is like basically completely overlapped in the beginning. You're getting stronger and building muscle as fast as humanly possible simultaneously for a very long time. And then if you want to diverge into more strength related pursuits, then yes, they diverge, the further you do something. But you certainly don't need to be like, oh, I should be focusing on sets of 3 to 5 in the beginning because I'm a beginner and I should focus on getting strong first. It just there's no rationale for that at all. I mean, if you want to build, I mean, what could be a rationale for that? Just psychologically, maybe there's something cool to expose people to, like, heavy hard sets. Maybe there's something psychologically there, but I actually think even more so working with more moderate loads in moderate rep ranges is probably more beginner friendly. So you don't need a strength base. You're going to get stronger doing hypertrophy. Sometimes I'll have people in my group, it's literally called the hypertrophies, right? So like obviously that's our goal. And I'll have people come in and they're like, well, was really hoping we'd focus on strength. I'm like, you should be doing that every time you come into the
Yeah.
gym. You did 8 last week, shoot for 9.
Exactly.
Like, what even is strength? Strength is a vague thing. Like, strength is a contextual word. Like, strength at what? Like, do you want to get better at a 1 rep max deadlift? Is that strength? What about an 8 rep max RDL?
Right. Right.
They're both
Yeah, you're right.
stronger.
It's like the specificity aspect of it, I think, is what people are talking about with strength, right? In the low rep range. But you're right. There's, my coach, Andy Baker, comes originally from the starting strength world, but definitely has broadened into what we're talking about. And, always makes the argument that if you work your leg press, it won't translate directly to a max PR squat the next day, but once you get the neuromuscular adaptation back, you'll get there quickly. Yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
no, that's super
Yeah.
well
Yeah.
said. And again,
Yeah.
your added context was translate to a max back squat, which with that added context changes the game for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. So maybe one or two more things around this aspect of time efficiency. What about splits? We talk about minimalism in terms of number of days. What do splits look like that for, say, beginner, intermediate versus advanced? Do we, like you said, do you need 5 or 6 days at some point, or can you be pretty effective at, say, 4 once you're intermediate forever?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think if I'm a bit of a cynic, maybe even a bit of a nihilist with this sort of thing, where I think that, if you are a beginner, that you grow with anything, grow with 2 days a week, grow with 3 days a week for a very, 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 very long time. You can grow with 3 days a week, especially if you're doing some of the stuff we talked about. 4 days a week starts to be the muddy water of like, maybe this is all you'll ever need. But if I was like, if someone puts a gun to my head and is like, hey, like, you need to be the biggest possible human you could ever be, I probably would train more than that. But I think over a 10 to 15 year span, a training career, so to speak, I think that the 4 day a week trainee and the 5 or 6 day a week trainee who have been doing all the right things, all else being equal, look indistinguishable from each other outside of on stage. And so I think that there's a bit of I know in my training career right now, I know what I would have to do to get a little bit bigger is such a bad ROI. I'm at
Hmm.
such a
Yeah.
diminishing returns point. I'm not even that big. I already think my diminishing. I'd have to be in gaining phases for most of the year. I'd need to be up in the 5, 6 days a week, really pushing my maximum recoverable volume, not doing nearly as much cardio, and I probably would get bigger for sure. But I do think that if you get to 4 days a week, I'll be honest, very practically speaking, I think outside of people who want to look like bodybuilders, the image you have in your head of the body you want can be achieved at 3 to 4 days a week. And outside of like, I want to be look like this person who has IFBB Pro at underscore on their name, you know?
Yeah, and then extrapolating that because it's not so much the number of days so much as what the number of days gets you. And so if someone's schedule was like they have a home gym and so they're not commuting and they don't have very much time for their sessions, could a 5 or 6 day kind of spread out the fatigue program match a 4 day program in that sense?
Absolutely. I mean, without a doubt, I actually
Yeah,
quite like this approach for people with home gyms. I quite like this for myself for a while. I trained 7 days a week for a while, and I went to 6 days a week for a while. But maybe two to three exercises a session, maybe like
they're
20
short.
minute sessions, and it worked fantastically well. I mean, there was like emotionally looking at that workout, there was never a moment where I was like, oh, I can't get through incline dumbbell press, single arm half kneeling pull down bicep curl. There was never like something that had happened to me where I'm like, I can't put 20 minutes in. And
Mhm.
so that was really accessible. I do find that psychologically, it wasn't my favorite over the long term. It was really great to experiment with, but I really liked having, like, when it comes to, there's almost like a buy-in fee in terms of fatigue, where for me, it was like, after doing that for many months, was, I started to add in some cardio, which I'm sure we'll transition to at some point, but it felt like a lot of two-a-days now all of a sudden, where just when I was looking at that, I was like, yeah, instead of doing this for 6 days, even if they're more like these workout snacks, again, total work across the week, equating to, let's say, 180 minutes across the week, some 4 by 45 or 3 by 60. This was like 6 by 30, right? 180. Cool. Good
Yeah,
math.
there you go.
Once I started incorporating some cardio, it felt like I was having two-a-days all the time, which psychologically now that started to take a toll. But your kind of initial comment of like, okay, but what, days per week doesn't really tell us much. It's a proxy for work potentially,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
someone's like, yeah, I'm training 6 days a week. They're doing 2 exercises per day. That is not a high volume program, even if it's a high frequency split, let's say. So you're 100% right. What the total work you do across the week matters by far the most. The only way to really violate that is to try and squeeze a 5 day program with like 25 plus working sets into one workout. But I've seen people do pretty well on like twice a week, 2 hour sessions.
Sure.
Yes, I think that there's plenty of arguments that there's probably some percentage of gains left on the table, again, because that's a pretty extreme example, but it does, whether we're talking about 3 or 4 or 5, I think how you split it up is less important than do you get the work done.
Yeah, no, cool. I want people to be aware of that and also not violate it in the other direction by saying, well, I'm going to work out 6 days a week for 90 minutes each day, because that's not what we're talking about. And then something else came to mind, and I'm losing it here, but it was related to, let's see, can't remember what it was. Why don't we transition into cardio? Because that's, you brought it up. All right.
Sounds good.
So I'm getting more into this myself, actually. Oh, I'm sorry. The other thing you mentioned was like if you have 6 or 7 days, like you pretty much can't have any 0 days or else your schedule gets off. And that's the psychological part I'm guessing you're talking about, where it's just you got to be super, super consistent constantly. So cycle between things could be helpful. All right. So cardio. First of all, what is the role of cardio if you're not an endurance athlete, but you're prioritizing hypertrophy? Because that's the assumption I want to make to start.
Yeah, I think that there's a whole host of theoretical physiological routes we can go with this conversation, but I will start
Mhm.
with saying I don't think there is any. And I know that's a bit of an absolute. I'll probably walk it back from that as far as an absolute statement, but I actually think that there's like for hypertrophy, you're just free to rest a little longer if you want. So when we're talking about like, hey, I only care about gains. Should I do cardio? Not really. General, you should do it for general health because a generally healthy person probably builds muscle a bit better. But if you're not watching this on YouTube, I'm squinting pretty hard when I say that. And so I think I think when we talk about cardio, it should
Hold on. Are you squinting because like if you're lifting and have that lifestyle, you're generally healthy?
No, no, no.
No.
I'm saying
Okay.
because I don't think that it's going to make you better at hypertrophy in a meaningful fashion.
Okay.
I
So
think
even the work capacity and all of that, you don't think has a
yeah,
moves
I
the
think
needle?
the work capacity shows up in your ability to recover between sets. So from an efficiency
Okay.
standpoint, I get let's say I do split squats and I do my right leg. Man, at my worst, peak 30 pounds heavier than I've been here, no cardio, 220 pounds. I rest 3 minutes between legs. I do one leg, I lay down on the
Mhm.
back on my back on the floor. Now in the best cardiovascular shape I've ever been in, which is to say like average across like a population level, I could do 75 seconds. I could do 60 seconds. I could train my right leg really freaking hard and be kind of ready to go again pretty soon. So my ability to do more work in a short span of time is better. So efficiency can
Time
improve,
efficiency. Look at
but
that.
but
Good
but
connection.
not
Yeah.
this like better work
Yeah.
capacity. It's interesting because better work capacity, the implication is I can do more work now. But I'd be interested if the ability to do more work, if what are those physiological adaptations that have made you able to do more work? Has that also turned you into a person who has to do more work? Right. If we talk about some of the adaptations from an AMPK perspective, from a fiber type perspective, I don't even think they're all that meaningful. I'm already transcending into something I don't think matters. But I don't think, oh, I'm in better cardiovascular shape, thus I can do more work. We've already decided we are talking about this in the context of a bit of efficiency. And so the ability to do more work, it's like, yeah, but I'm already capped for time. And
Mm.
so I think this matters more from going in a state of poor health to a state of generally better health. So if we're talking about somebody who has obesity potentially, not in a metabolically healthy place, if we get them to a place where they improve their cardiovascular fitness, they can now probably survive an hour of hard training. But if you're already kind of a generally healthy person who can do an hour of lifting without like keeling over, like getting an even better cardiovascular shape, I don't see how that makes you better at hypertrophy. I'm the biggest advocate of people doing cardio. So let's just like get that out of the way. I'm a complete
Yeah.
cardio nut
Yeah.
job.
We can talk. Yeah. Yeah. No, we can get into that. But yeah.
But
Yeah.
yeah, I'm not sold on that as an aspect, I guess.
And I want to connect to that in like with real world examples here because a lot of my clients are longtime lifters who want to work on their nutrition. Some of them have desk jobs, so they get like 3,000 steps a day. Their resting heart rate isn't as low as it could be. Right, they have some of the lower cardiovascular health, but it hasn't really slowed them down in the gym. Is kind of what you're saying. It really hasn't. Now, once they start walking a little more, they get a little bit healthier. They don't get out of breath as much. But like you said, maybe it doesn't quite move the needle unless you're coming from a very obese, very sedentary situation. Okay.
Yeah, yeah, agreed.
Yeah. So then if there's not much of a, let's say, positive other than a little bit of this in between set recovery, what other reason will we have cardio or, should we do cardio? What's the dosage like that? That's where I'm going because and also fat loss versus gaining because people think of it as a cardio or a calorie burning thing, which we know there's a lot of misconceptions there as well. So
Yeah,
go
cool.
down all that rabbit hole. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, I've just closed the book on that. Just to clarify before I have the pitchforks out, is like I just don't think that the average person who's only like if someone's like, "Hey, I'm doing cardio," I'm like, "What are you doing it for?" And they're like, "So I can get more jacked." It's like I don't think that there's a direct route that you can point me towards. But moving to like why you should do it, general health. I mean, general health is a bit vague. Cardiovascular fitness, pulmonary function, just like every other like if you think of health as a pie chart and you think of all of the things you could do and having a full pie chart every kind of sliver filled is the optimally healthy person. The truth is, and I've been, I grew up as a very hypertrophy focused, complete, egomaniac, only cared about how I looked, like, which by the way is great. It kind of, whatever, it served me as like a young 20-year-old idiot. But like, if somebody were to ask me, hey, Jordan, I lift and I eat nutritious foods. I don't have too much body fat. And, I get, a decent amount of steps, but that's it. I don't do any cardio. Is that enough to be optimally healthy? The technical answer is no, because you use the word optimally. If you said is that enough to be generally healthy, go to my doctor and have good blood markers, absolutely. And I have people that train 4 days a week, get 10,000 steps, eat nutritious foods, try not to have too much body fat, and are doing just fantastically well. And I think that is, if we talk about the pie chart, filling it a ton. It's filling that pie chart a ton. But that person, there's this blank sliver here, and it's covered by something more intense than walking, right? Some sort of
Mhm.
cardio more intense by walking. And then even that sliver is, and I don't want to say sliver like it's a small sliver, it's actually quite a big sliver in terms of the pursuit of optimal health is going to be covered by some form of higher intensity, higher just meaning higher than walking the dog. And so I think for general health, we're talking listen, CDC physical activity guidelines, we're talking 150 minutes of low to moderate intensity cardio, which for some people could just be intentional walking, brisk walking. For other more fit people, just on average for that person, it's going to mean maybe zone two training. And then, or 75 minutes of vigorous exercise, which is, whatever, more in that like north of zone two, jogging, sports, something where you're, really getting your heart rate up, huffing and puffing. So 150 minutes, low to moderate, 75 minutes vigorous exercise is the CDC guideline for physical activity. And what's funny is like people are like really anti-government recommendations for stuff. The RDA for protein sucks, the RDA for salt sucks. Well, like we could have those chats, but they get this one spot on.
Hi, my name is Alan, and I just want to give a shout out to Philip Pape of Wits and Weights for being a huge part of the foundation for my continued health and well-being. Philip exemplifies a nutrition coach who demonstrates how much he cares. Philip works tirelessly and with dedication to provide coaching support and major content for us to use. He creates a practical approach from research, and Philip empowers all of us to use food as quality for our health. He is skilled in how to assess and direct nutrition. Philip creates a community full of wisdom, support, and camaraderie. In summary, Philip Pape is the real deal. He knows how to assess and direct nutrition, and he continues to steer me in the right direction. Thank you, Philip.
If you are like a confused person for where to start, 150 minutes a week of low to moderate intensity cardio and 2 days per week lifting. That is their recommendation, and it is incredible. And they get it so spot on that I just chuckle because I feel like there's just such an anti like government recommendations when it comes to health, but they really do get that spot on.
So if we were to extrapolate a person's lifetime, right? Let's say they're a lifter, they lift 3 days a week, they get 10,000 steps, they eat nutritiously, they get enough sleep, their stress is good. Longevity wise, because that's the other argument people make, or maybe there's complicated things going on at the cellular level with mitochondria, with everything else, right? Is there anything that says, hey, you're going to miss out or you're going to like die 5 years sooner or something like that without having some little more vigorous cardio in there?
We don't have a longitudinal study of people who didn't do any cardio and another group who did, just like looking into looking into those people's lives after the last 25 years, seeing when they die. We don't necessarily have that, but we do have a non-perfect piece of data that VO2 max is the single greatest correlate to healthy aging, to longevity, is VO2 max, not muscle mass. And I'm not muscles. Again, a muscle is the fucking fountain of youth, man. I'm biggest advocate of lifting. It's just like there's nothing like it. It's completely unique. You need to be doing it. And I wouldn't, there's a lot of people who are like, let's say more on the cardio is way better side of things, which I'm not, that will hang their hat on this research of, hey, VO2 max is the single greatest correlate to healthy aging that we have. And it's a correlate, people who live longer probably also have healthy VO2 maxes. And so, there's a bit of healthy user bias maybe. And so it's not a human randomized control trial. It's not a 30-year cohort study. It's not like this amazing thing, but like it is, you can't really get away from the fact that improving your VO2 max is whatever. And VO2 max doesn't need to be complicated. Let's use that as a proxy for cardiovascular fitness. Who cares? People with good cardiovascular fitness, that's like an amazing correlate for healthy aging. And so it's really hard to reconcile that.
Okay, so then the other side, fine, yeah, and I'm totally on board with all of that because I don't have to start telling my clients you need to do 3 HIIT sessions a week or you're gonna just die young. The other side is what the interference effect, and we know that's been overblown as well, but there is some negative from too much cardio, I would suspect. So, and also depending on your recovery capacity, your age, and also if you're gaining or losing. Given all of that, like what is general recommendation for dosing if you want to have that in there, maybe because you enjoy it, maybe just because you like to do it, or you're doing a sport, something like that?
Yeah, I'll start by saying you're doing too much if you start to regress. And I don't want to just be myopic and very reductionist and make it all about that, but the greatest indication of recovery is performance. And so am I consistently performing, and that means ability to progress at stuff. And so if we were to take a hypothetical of a person who lifts, who wants to do some cardio, how do they know they're doing too much? And it's like, if you start showing up to your lifts and you can't progress and you start to regress, and I don't just mean as a one-off, by the way, that shit happens. You have a day, something didn't progress, you matched last week, no worries. I'm talking about a trend of regression, a trend of feeling fatigued, a trend of showing up to the gym and not being able to match what you did the previous week. That is a sign of I'm doing more on average than I can recover from. Now, you can blame the cardio there, but it is technically more of like your cup is full from everything you've poured into it. And if you care about lifting, then you'd look at the cardio as, hey, that's interfering with what I really want. If you're an average lifter and you're like, hey, I hear Jordan talking about this like sliver of health thing that I should probably care about, but I really like aesthetically care about getting jacked and I'm short on time. Where do I put my eggs? I would start with, if you had 2 days of cardio, one of them I would do low intensity zone 2 training. One of them I would do something higher, something in the zone 3, 4, 5. I think there's a lot of room for not needing to be so crazy with where you are in that context. But I think that there are adaptations that happen at higher intensities that happen much better there. And there are adaptations at a low intensity that, the biggest benefit of doing low intensity cardio is it's less likely to interfere with your lifting. There's all this talk about zone 2 training. There's so much hype right now. The biggest benefit of zone 2 is that it has an elite SFR. Is you can do so much zone. You can do and benefit from so much. The way my coach Alex Viata, shout out Matt Smart, described zone 2 as it has a really low floor in terms of how much you need to do and get a benefit, and it has no ceiling. And so it's like you can do 30 minutes of zone 2 and it's helpful and not fatiguing. And you can do 300 minutes a week of zone 2 and not get tired. And it's not so black and white. Technically, everything has a fatigue cost, but practically speaking, if you're a lifter who's like, man, I don't want to do that thing Jordan just said where I show up to my lift and I can't progress. Cool. Start with some zone 2 sessions, which just means slightly more intense than going out for a walk in the park. Some incline walking, for doing the Stairmaster a little bit faster, some biking, like something that's a little bit more intense than walking the dog.
Maybe rucking. Yeah. So now I want to explore that a little bit. I heard you talking about the SFR of endurance activities. I think that may be on Jeff's podcast. I thought it was a nice parallel because we always use it in the lifting world. And I think they have more well-established understanding of that, if anything, in the cardio world. But if, let's say in a fat loss phase, recovery capacity is limited, and you're trying to keep that expenditure relatively high, and you normally would get, say, 10 to 15,000 steps, would it be more effective from an SFR perspective then to replace some of those steps with zone 2 in this context and get more for your time without added fatigue?
Yeah, definitely. Oh my God, definitely. I think if you're someone who normally gets on the treadmill and walks at 3 miles an hour and you're looking for a way to not cost yourself more time, but get more benefit, walk at 3 miles an hour on a 10 incline, get your heart rate, whatever, roughly in like 120 to 150. It could differ for people, but yeah, been telling clients that like, hey, we're not necessarily looking for an addition of another session, but you're already going for a walk outside. What if you jogged for 30 seconds 5 times throughout the walk and you were able to just reach up and get a little bit of that benefit that's that you can only get at higher intensities. I'm probably said this on Jeff's podcast, but every time we talk about cardio, as a person who comes from a lifting background, has a big community that is very lifting dominant, we run the risk of making people feel like they have another thing they have to do. And I know this is great. Trust me, we have a great chat here about efficiency. Like you obviously work with real people because that's where you're coming from here. And so I really do think that, okay, guys, listen, we're not trying to say you need to go ahead and all of a sudden do 5 days of zone 2, but maybe look at, it's like when people are trying to increase their portion or their protein intake. It's like, before we freak out about anything, take the protein you're already eating and increase the portion size.
Scale it up. Yep.
Right. And so that's kind of what we're saying here. If you already get on the elliptical 5-10 minutes, let's say you do like a 5-minute warm up before your session. Maybe it's 15 minutes now and it's zone 2. And maybe on the back end of that, you throw another 15 minutes and it's slightly faster. The thing about zone 2 is like, it's not actually challenging. Zone 2 is more boring than it is hard. Like you're done with a zone 2 session and you can't wait to get off, more because you're like kind of just want to go do other things, less because you're like knackered. I don't know why I've never said knackered in my whole life, but that's the word we're going to go with.
It's cool. Oh man, there was a word used on the other podcast. I thought was like the word of the day. You must have like a thesaurus ready to go with it was concomitant.
Concomitant.
Like, yeah. It was cool. Okay. Well, one more cardio question, and that is during a fat loss phase, what are your just general thoughts on using cardio for expenditure when you can fit it in? Is it anything beyond what we just talked about? Because some people, again, I think overdo it.
Yeah, I definitely think some people overdo it. I would put at the top of that hierarchy of like steps as a proxy for overall movement, and certainly the thing that I would talk about most. Get X amount of steps, do it in a way that you enjoy, then feel sustainable. Let's have a discussion about fatigue if you're first two answers to that question have you doing nothing but a ton of high intensity sprinting and running, because then I think we might be looking at some fatigue bleeding over. But I'm way more concerned with people getting enough total movement in a way they enjoy that feels sustainable before I'm worried about what and how they're doing that. I think I've been more open to the idea of, hey, if you always walk, what if you tried doing some zone 2? Like, it's rare that I'll encourage somebody to change what they're doing if they're already getting like 8 to 12,000 steps. Like, I'm super pumped that that's a very active person. But there is something to be said, maybe when people who are even more active, like just walk, all they do is walk 15,000 steps. And if they are they're like looking under a rug for something to help them push fat loss a bit more. Maybe they've hit a plateau and they don't want to go lower in calories. I'll take a complete flyer. I'm putting a million disclaimers here because I don't think it's a big deal, but changing what you're doing based on a theoretical efficiency that you've built doing that thing. So
Yes.
if you just walk, you're getting 15,000 steps a day. Man, am I going to tell you to go do 20 and just walk even more? You're probably so efficient at that movement that those next 5,000 steps, that's a 33% increase. You're not getting an extra 33% calorie burn.
No.
It's a lot less. So maybe I'm like, hey, you've been walk at like zone 1, more like just getting like movement throughout the day. What if you did a couple days of higher intensity, a couple of days of zone 2? Maybe you change the modality. You don't even have them do higher intensity. You're like, oh, you were walking, let's bike. Let's do something you're a little less efficient at. And efficiency is great for performance. It's less good when you're trying to burn calories, which
True. Yeah.
we're not trying to make cardio all about that. But I also think in the same breath, like, that is a good thing cardio does. Like, let's be real. Like, it's like moving more is, if you're like, yes or no, moving more will correlate better with like weight maintenance. Like, yes, but I wouldn't want people like getting super hyper focused on the calorie burn side of things.
Nice. I think it's a really important message for people to hear, because we do hear that a lot. I've had people say, well, I'm doing 20 or 25,000 steps. I'm like, oh, you know how much compensation's probably going on, since it's the exact same thing. And yeah, I've heard that argument before. If you're really clumsy at biking and you never do it, go bike, because you're going to be burning a ton more calories per work put in. So yeah, great ideas. And your sort of quotable from this section that I like, that was just very simply put, was, the greatest indication of recovery is performance. I just want people to remember that, because that is a great self-limiting thing that you can experiment with and measure. All right, metabolic adaptation. Let's get into that, my man here. I've talked about this on the show many times, but I enjoy the brutally clear way that you explain it, especially the fact that it just exists. We can't change that it exists, and people misconstrue that concept with behaviors and lifestyles and things that you can do around the fact that adaptation exists. So what is it? Why doesn't it matter? And what should we really put our energy into caring about?
Cool. Good. Let's see. Let's keep it succinct. We'll keep the vocab going.
I know that's a lot.
Metabolic adaptation means, when we're talking about in the context of fat loss, is the reduction in metabolic rate beyond which you'd expect from the weight loss alone. So if you were 200 pounds and you're now 150, like, you're a smaller machine that requires less energy. Metabolic adaptation is, well, based on mathematically how much we would predict, how much less energy we think you would need based on the fact that you're 3/4 the size. We see that there's an additional reduction in metabolic rate beyond which you'd expect from just the weight loss alone. So that is what metabolic adaptation is. The reason I think metabolic adaptation and hormones are fascinating to learn about, fascinating to talk about, and should never come up in your brain as a regular person. Like, it's just, they're simultaneously fascinating, but also not anything. They are things that, like, we won't go to the hormone side. Let's stay focused here, Jordan. From a metabolic adaptation perspective, it's just, the truth is, like, the things that you should be really focused on are modifiable variables.
Mhm.
And so, like, accept the things you cannot change, all that whole quote thing, but like, you can't do anything about metabolic adaptation. You can do things to continue to see success in the face of metabolic adaptation, but as an isolated variable, you can't affect metabolic adaptation. You can do things like lift weights. You can do things like, because maintaining muscle, gives you that slight benefit of having more muscle. You can maintain a step count, because what we see is that the greatest portion where reduction happens is in your subconscious movement. So if subconscious movement is going down, subconscious by definition is something you can't do anything about. You can manually override by making sure you're hitting your step count. And so you can do things to make metabolic adaptation less of an issue, but you can't do anything to affect it. And the reason I think that that's such an important distinction is because there is so much rhetoric around fixing a damaged metabolism, healing metabolic adaptation, reversing metabolic adaptation. Like there's just no reason to believe that that's even possible. Well, it is possible, but it's just not ever, it should never be the thing you're trying to do. Metabolic adaptation exists. When you go into a calorie deficit, your body doesn't know if that's a starvation million years ago or a voluntary calorie deficit in 2024. And so processes happen, down regulation of thyroid and sex hormones, cortisol goes up, hunger signals go up, all of that. But you can't do anything about it. Now, you can do practical things to make your fat loss phase more successful, but they don't have anything to do with blunting metabolic adaptation or reverse dieting at the end to heal metabolic adaptation. And the reason I'm so bullish on this is because if this was an area of research that we didn't know a lot about, and we were doing a lot of like mechanistic speculation of like, oh, this would make sense. And metabolism can upregulate. I mean, we have a ton of research. Metabolism can upregulate, and I can word vomit on that. But if this was something we weren't quite sure about, and we were really trying to fill the gaps with something we think made sense, and this kind of has some people out there who have had experiences like this, fine. But we do have a ton of research on this. Like we have boatloads. We could sink the Titanic with the amount of research we have on weight loss and weight regain and changes in metabolism when people do that. And so that to me is something that Eric Trexler opened my eyes to in the last couple of years of like, you know what? Like if this was something we weren't all that sure about, like I could change my tone and accept people making like logical leaps. But we have a ton of research and when I say ton of research, what I mean is that the idea of, all right, what are my biggest gripes here? Let me get the gripes out on the stage. Is that if you go into a calorie deficit and you lose weight and then you gain that weight back, there's an idea that if you keep doing that you will have a reduced metabolic rate. That is not something we see in the literature. We see the complete cessation, the complete reversal, the complete undoing of metabolic adaptation all the way back to baseline when people regain the weight back. And so this idea of you're not losing weight because of metabolic adaptation or because you were a chronic dieter or because you're a chronic undereater and you have a damaged metabolism and you have to eat more so that you can fix it. It's that I don't even remember what this guy's name is. Oh my God, it's so depressing. The like it never happened guy. The like it never happened. It's made up. Like
yeah, I don't know who
this one was written by a writer. I gotta show it to you. Hysterical. Yeah. But like that just doesn't happen. That's just not a thing. And my last gripe with that is that like there are people out there listening to this right now. They're like, Jordan, that's not true. That's what happened to me. I increased my calories and I started losing weight, or I increased my calories and then I was able to go down and cut at higher calories. So they have a lived experience that seems to go counter to what I'm saying. And I love that for you. I'm so happy when someone's like, no, Jordan, I was eating 1,200 every day. And then my coach reverse dieted me up to 2,000. And now I'm cutting on 1,700 and losing weight. I'm so happy for that person, but I mean this in the nicest way. Like that did not happen. Like technically that did not happen. Your experience totally happened, but you were not eating 1,200. And by changing your targets in MyFitnessPal to 2,000, what actually happened was you were able to be more consistent, actually adhere to your calories, and actually probably reduce the average calories you are eating because at 1,200, you binged every 6th, 7th day on the weekend. Right. Or you're forgetting calories here and there. And so I just think metabolic adaptation isn't something you can do anything about. It exists in differing amounts. We have, it's highly genetic, highly individual, and it's not stopping you from losing weight. It's not the reason you're overweight. I'm not sympathetic to the fact that weight loss is hard. All I'm saying is that's not the boogeyman.
I agree with everything, man. I mean, I did an episode a while back called Why Reverse Dieting Doesn't Work Like You Think, because same thing. Trexler was actually on the show. We talked about that. And, I use recovery dieting with folks all the time. It works wonders. Just come right back to maintenance. It's the best way to recover. So a few things come to mind. First, you mentioned that you can't do anything about your baseline metabolism, right? You can definitely change your NEAT, which, like you said, is the thing that unconsciously goes down. And actually, maybe think of our cardio conversation, because I like to track cardio and steps separately sometimes, because if people add cardio, their steps will go down often, right? Compensating, even when they don't realize it, even though your cardio is a proxy for steps. But there's, I think Greg Nuckols was talking about it on Stronger by Science recently, the tolerance that we have for BMR in the population around the mean that calculators tell us is like 800 calories. But for any individual, it hardly changes, right, over your entire lifetime until you're like in your 60s and 70s and it starts to drop. And that could be because of muscle mass anyway. That's one. And then I did want to ask you a question, however, because this comes up. we want to keep the rate of loss reasonable when we're in a dieting phase, not just for the sustainability of it, right? But also the metabolic adaptation or the loss of muscle mass. We don't want to lose too much muscle. Does metabolic adaptation accelerate? Is there like a curve where if you go too quickly, the adaptation above and beyond, like you said, the weight loss changes, or is it fairly linear? Like, can we answer that?
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. You should have Martin McDonald come on and talk about this. It's like a rubber band. Metabolic adaptation is like a rubber band. If you pull a rubber band back 3 inches fast, well, this is actually a bad example because if you pull it back fast and let go quickly, then it will react with a stronger force. But if I pull it back quickly 3 inches and hold it there, or I pull back slowly 3 inches and hold it there, there's the same amount of tension on this rubber band. And so this idea of like, oh, you're gonna be I have more time if you're like, we want to rant more on this, but this idea of you're gonna go so low don't go so low in calories because then you'll have nowhere to go. That just doesn't make any sense at all. I'm not saying to diet aggressively. I think there's practical reasons not to go aggressive for sure, but it's not because you'll adapt and then you'll have nowhere to go. You know what the biggest adaptation that you'll make to 1,000 calories? A ton of weight loss. Like the biggest adaptation we make is the accrual of or loss of tissue, muscle tissue, fat tissue, all tissue. And so if you're like, a 200-pound person and there's someone out there like, don't go to 1,000 calories because it's going to tank your metabolism or you're going to adapt too quickly and you'll have nowhere to go. You'll adapt a lot quickly at 100 by the time you're 150 pounds.
But you'll lose a bunch of weight too. Yeah.
Now again, that's not a suggestion. It's only just to remember the calorie number you choose to use. That's just not a factor in your decision making. I'm even more bullish on the muscle loss isn't a factor in the decision. And I think that's a contestable thing. That I happen to stand on the side of, I don't care if you lose, if you lose 20 pounds and 4 of it is muscle, I think you gain those 4 pounds of muscle back in the next 4 months of training and eating with more food. So I'm not too worried about it. I think if you can avoid losing muscle, you absolutely should. But if I have a client who's, going to perform better on their overall calories on 0.5 grams per pound of protein, again, I think from a satiety perspective, I'd nudge them higher.
Right.
From
There's other practical.
From a muscle building perspective, I'd nudge them higher. But if they're bullish on like, I don't want to eat that much and I'll nail my calories, but I'm not eating them. Okay, great. I'm not worried about you losing muscle. You're going to lose 20 pounds. You're going to be super mega happy as long as you're training. I mean, the training stimulus is like infinitely more stimulative towards muscle growth than the deficit is catabolic, than the protein is anabolic. Yeah, I'm not worried about short-term deficits causing muscle loss. I'm worried if you're a chronic lifter, you know what I mean? If like you're a lifetime lifter, then this is just a non-issue. If we're looking at a graph of like that would be going up in lifting, it's like you're digging a hole. And every time the hole gets deeper, you're building more muscle. It's like, okay, for this one deficit, you kicked a little dirt in the hole, but like you're still digging. So, okay, the dirt went in the hole and, in the next 3 months, you're still bigger than you were before. So I'm not so worried about that.
Yeah, bodybuilders show us it can be done over and over again. They get down to crazy leanness over, 8-month-long cuts, and it still works. And it's funny because Dr. Bill Campbell is on. He's going to be on next week as well. We're going to talk about rapid fat loss because he's doing all that research, which is amazing. And I think it was Abel Sabai, is that how you say his name? Who I'm talking about?
Yeah.
He was recently talking about the exact thing you said where, maybe we shouldn't be so concerned about the muscle loss if you're training hard. And if you want to go more aggressively, just do it. If you want to go 1.2, 1.5% and you can handle it, do it. Now, there's the practical and sustainability factors where, most of my clients, I'm not going to do that with them. But occasionally lifters, we'll do that 2-week, super fast micro cut, get them out. And like you said, metabolic adaptation increases, but so does the weight loss. So you're kind of getting one for the other. And when I look at people's expenditure curves, generally it just trends fairly linear in parallel with their weight loss. So it's not like it's dropping way down below the rate of weight loss. Okay. So I was going to ask you a bunch of questions about like rate of loss and stuff, but I mean, people have heard that a million times here. What else about metabolic adaptation do we want to address? Because there's the psychological aspect. You talked about one of the illusions. I think Trexler called them the illusions of it. Diet breaks, refeeds, things like that. We talked about on the show that these are mainly psychological. Do you agree that 100% that's what they're for, or is there some other benefit?
No, I think they're psychological, but I probably there was a period of my coaching where I went really hard on that rhetoric and treated. Listen, let's be real. Like, the goal is to get your clients the best success that you can, and that means I got really bullish about, hey, you don't need to take diet breaks unless you need to, and what that means is like the implications, we're going to diet with an open-ended time frame until you feel like shit. And then we'll diet break. Yeah, all right. And then we'll diet break on any time scale we want. Maybe it's a day at maintenance, 2 days of maintenance, 3 days of maintenance. Shout to Bill Campbell, brilliant man, but his diet refeed study had some flaws. And I don't think that for the average person, it makes any difference physiologically. But have circled back around recently, just an alternative appeal to psychology, saying maybe people do better with loose timelines. And so I've
Mhm.
combined the two of them, and I'd say, hey, like we're starting this diet. I'll first ask, do you have something on the calendar, a life event that we could shoot for and say, hey, let's take a break then. And if we're along the way and you feel like crap, let's take a break. And so giving people a light at the end of the tunnel, but keeping the door open has become my new mentality. And on the metabolic adaptation thing, things that I'd be remiss if we didn't say would be there's no amount of eating more that will change how your body adapts in the future. And the reason that's so powerful is because there's just so much rhetoric of that's exactly what people are
Yeah.
doing, selling you reverse dieting. And I want people to think about this for a second. If you ask any bodybuilder, I had oh my god, Australian dude, great content.
No, not Steve.
No,
Australian.
bodybuilder coach. His wife is Lauren Simpson. Sorry, oh my god.
Who's
Mark Carroll. Oh my God. Someone
okay.
scream.
Okay.
I had Mark Carroll on the podcast and we were talking. He's like, the guy's coached a million women to stage. If eating more changed how your body adapted to less calories in the future, bodybuilders would have the easiest job ever. And so I said, Mark, like when you're dieting people to stage for the 10th time, does it get any easier? Because think about it, 10 times they went down and then they reverse dieted. And if that process of eating more affected how their body would adapt in the future, it should get easier every time. It
Right.
gets, if anything, it gets harder every time. And Mark says it almost to the exact calorie comes out to the same. And so the entire off season that a bodybuilder spends eating more food doesn't change the fact that they go to the exact same calorie amount to get to the exact same body fat level. So there's no amount of eating more that will change how your body adapts to calories in the future. Like even if the metabolism adapts upward, which it does, of course it does. Metabolic adaptation happens in both ways. We didn't talk about it, but whatever. There's no like starting with a higher calorie number has nothing to do with where you'll ultimately end up. Metabolic adaptation happens within 24 hours. And so, you again, not to shout Trexler, but like when we looked at research of like what are some of the common factors of people who undergo the most metabolic adaptation? The common factor of people who undergo more metabolic adaptation when they're dieting is having higher baseline metabolic rates. It's like the ultimate irony. It's like the people who saw more metabolic adaptation were starting with higher calories. And so this idea of, well, if I could just start with higher calories, or even like that guy over there that I know, Jordan's, it must be so easy for him. He starts at higher calories than me, or like, that isn't technically true. And what I loved in that initial episode between Eric and Greg is Greg talking about the fact that Greg is like, well, he was like 220 at the time trying to lose weight, and he was on 1,800 calories. And he was having so many people say, that's too little, that's too little, that's too little,
Yeah.
making the assumption that he must be tired, must be losing muscle, must be hungry, must be fucking up his metabolism. And he's like, guys, like, I feel fine. I'm losing at a half pound a week. What am I supposed to do with that information? Like, mathematically, it's like 8 times body weight, right? Which we think might be low, but we need to get less emotional about the numbers in absolute and start dealing with the facts of how my client feels and what the data is telling me.
Yeah. Agree. Because there's things you can't change. I think the biggest indicator of your BMR, the correlator, is your organ size, right?
Absolutely.
So you can't do anything about
Totally.
that. Okay. Do you have a couple more minutes?
Yeah, I got time.
Okay, because I love talking about this. And one other thing that comes up often is hormones. And we don't have to go down too deep a rabbit hole, but like thyroid hormone, for example, which we know is a kind of a direct regulator of your metabolic rate in some sense. Do we include that in the equation of metabolic adaptation, or are we considering that a different variable that affects your metabolism and caused by imbalances or dysfunction or something? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
I'm counting it. I'm certainly counting it in there. It is one of the adaptations that happens metabolically just because of its impact on metabolism. So for sure, the interesting thing, so people will say that to me all the time. Well, what if my thyroid's tanked? And I'm like, well, first of all, if you need medication, get medication. And I think if you have hypothyroid, that's like, you're absolutely right. You should fix that. But let's say you're just an average person who thinks your thyroid is tanked. I'll use that word because that's the one that's thrown around from dieting. It's like, okay, so when we deficit, thyroid goes down. And your plan is to eat more to make thyroid go up. What do you think is going to happen again when you go back to eating less? I just mean, like, it is interesting to me that you're trying to fix a problem that was caused by X. assuming that when you go back to doing X, that same problem won't come back. And so it is a outside of like mega niche scenarios. I don't even know if there are mega niche scenarios. That niche scenario being somebody who requires medication. A lot of people are like, yeah, well, what if your hormones are in a bad spot? I'm like, what caused the hormones being in a bad spot? You're like dieting. And I'm like, well, what are you going to do after you eat more? They're like, diet. I'm like, well, what do you think's going to happen then? They're like, not the same thing that happened last time. Like, I just don't, I crack up. I'm like, yeah, we're not getting anywhere.
Yeah. No, I like to ask because there is a difference, like you said, between a medical condition and just the natural cause result of dieting. I definitely have had some clients, premenopausal women who
Totally.
all of a sudden had medical issues with their thyroid. And if we had been tracking properly before then, we see a very different metabolism all of a sudden. And then that's a red flag. Alcohol, sleep, stress, all of these other factors, again, do they affect metabolic adaptation or do they just affect the kind of compensatory factors that cause you to burn fewer calories? You know
Yeah,
what I mean? Yeah.
they affect your experience and they affect your dieting experience. And so lack of sleep, stress, they are things that will make this harder. They aren't things that will make you lose less weight. Transiently, we can talk about water fluctuations up and down, but I think that
Mhm.
that's almost again a non thing to talk about because it is transient in both directions. But lack of sleep and having a lot of stress are more likely to impact how you feel on a day to day basis. Your proclivity to want to get up and move, your feelings of optimism, your likelihood to do something that's good for you. Even willpower, which is a bit vague, but kind of willpower kind of bundles up a lot of that stuff. Your like natural proclivity to want to make decisions that are positive for you. That is all affected, but they are all to the left of the equation. They're not an outcome. They are things that impact your experience and how you feel. And they're super duper relevant. I mean, God, I've gotten to a point where I'm like, we're not doing a deficit until you're sleeping 7 hours a
Yeah.
night, just
Yeah.
because I've seen how hard that can make things.
Right.
But again, if someone's like, hey, I'm not sleeping, can I lose weight? I'm like, yeah, physiologically, sure.
Yeah. Some of the misunderstandings I think come from the fact that lack of sleep makes you hungry. And therefore, if you weren't tracking, you end up consuming more, thinking you're consuming the same, it's things like that. Just a couple more questions. One is and this is actually kind of a selfish question because I had a very interesting experience last year with surgery, rotator cuff surgery, where post recovery, and apparently there's studies that support this from like the 80s that show your metabolic rate skyrockets during the recovery process because of all the new tissue being rebuilt after a rotator cuff repair. And my metabolism skyrocketed by about 300 calories within like a few weeks. And so I started to lose weight. But then it dropped, and it dropped much further than it was before. And I'm in a gaining phase. And then it started to build, and is almost back to where it was. Is that a case of like the Biggest Loser phenomenon where it just takes a lot longer to recover, but it's still going to recover? Is there something else going on? Like, hey, maybe my NEAT just wasn't as high, which I think it was, but just wondering about your thoughts.
So you had surgery and the reparation process boosted metabolic rate, which it totally does. And then after that process was done, you'd returned the tissue back to baseline. You're saying that the data would say that your metabolic rate dropped lower than that 300, lower than whatever it was elevated.
Right. And I'm
And
using macro factor. So
and so you
we've got the
started
data.
gaining weight, basically.
Yeah, and then I've intentionally been gaining weight ever since last April. And my point was the expenditure dropped even further below where it had been before, and it took a lot longer to recover from previous cycles. Because we talked about earlier, I brought it up because you mentioned earlier how like with bodybuilders, we always get back to the same levels no matter what. And I've seen that personally, every bulk, every cut. And this one was different because it's like not up to where it normally is by a few hundred calories. So I just wanted to throw that at you as like an interesting scenario and wondered your thoughts on it. That's all.
Yeah, that is an interesting scenario.
Yeah.
I'm
Not to put you on the spot.
No. It's good. It's good. It's good
Yeah.
to talk about these just from a hypothetical standpoint. I don't think that it is the case that there was like some sort of recoil effect, some sort of like, oh, it bounced up really high, and that the physiological response of, that you're like, I'm not saying you said this, but like that your
Mhm.
body was like tired from putting on all that tissue, so it
Sure.
recoiled by reducing metabolic rate thereafter. You know what I do in times like this? Like, as much as we're having great conversation about like what we know about metabolism, I do think that is also why I come back to center and say, we got to deal with the data in front of us.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
there's
Deal
a
with
healthy
reality.
balance. There's a healthy balance of being a detective and trying to figure out why something's happening and being a realist and acting upon what is happening. And I think a lot of people spend so much time in the, well, why am I up a pound today? Why didn't I lose weight this week? Why aren't I losing weight? Why isn't the number that I got from this calorie calculator working? Instead of, this is not yielding the response that I should be getting. What do I do about it? A lot of, I should be losing weight. I shouldn't
Mhm.
have to go this low. I should be, and less of like, this is my lived reality. Let me take how I feel and the data into account and act on it. But as a hypothesis, I really don't know. That's interesting though.
Yeah, we can follow up on that. I mean, yeah. So, like you said, so what did I do? I just adjusted my calories where they needed to be based on that, and I've been riding
How,
it ever
how
since.
dare you?
You know,
How dare you not freak out and just adjust your calories accordingly?
I know. So
Yeah.
it was fun when I got to up them significantly after
Yeah.
surgery, even though I didn't need them because I couldn't train for a few weeks. But anyway, okay, cool. So I do like to ask this question of all guests, Jordan. What one question did you wish I had asked, and what is your answer?
Yeah, it was the thing I just said, so I blew it. And it was what's like a where do you find the most frustration with the metabolic adaptation reverse dieting community? Where do I find the most frustration? And it's the rhetoric of feeling like they should be losing weight, and it's the emotional attachment to numbers in absolute. And so I talk about this client once in a while, invariably people get upset. It's like a client, she's 160 pounds, like pretty active, pretty muscular, and when we diet, she's regularly in the 1200s to lose weight, 8 times body weight, let's say. And she loses at a rate that would indicate that that's not a huge deficit. She loses 0.5% to 1% a week. She loses maybe 3/4 of a pound a week. And she has maintenance calories that are quite low. And the reason that I think I share her so much is because she came to me from like many, 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 many coaches reverse dieting her to the point where she gained like 40 pounds. Um, and she gained 40 pounds because the coaches couldn't believe that she was gaining on X, right? I say X because that's how you should think of it. She was gaining at 150 pounds, 14,000 steps on 1,700 calories. Blood work looks great. Thyroid was great. Sex hormones were great. Biofeedback was great. Sleep was great. Mood was great. Lifts were great. Like without looking at that number, this was a person who was, by all accounts, at maintenance calories, thriving. But the number in absolute, when seen by the coaches, fueled them to
Mm.
raise her calories. And then when she started gaining weight, was told, hey, you just need to keep doing this, keep doing this, keep doing this. Oh, and when she ultimately jumped ship, it was, you quit too soon. And so she's had so much success, lost 30 pounds, in the best shape of her life. And I don't just mean at the expense of her health. I mean, while, like, if you were to watch her biofeedback trends, if you could somehow map all of them, you'd be like, wow, this person was in a very moderate sized deficit from a state of good health, didn't trend too deep into underweight.
Mhm.
But when I tell you the calorie number, people freak out. And so I think that there's this emotional attachment to the number that, when people are really emotionally attached to the number, what it says is they think this is a very exact science. They think that
Mm.
because I think I'm eating X, I'm really eating X. Because the package says it's 340, it's really 340. Because the calorie tracker says this, and the net carbs, and there's so many
Mhm.
variables that go into this that, like you said, from a metabolic perspective, if we take averages, there's up to 800%, an
Yeah.
800 calorie difference from what the calorie calculator told you. And so I think a lot of coaches, and I'm not saying, if you have a 180-pound person who comes to you and is saying, hey, I'm not losing weight, and they're like, how much are you eating? And they're like 1,200, that you should say, yeah, go ahead, just eat 1,100. Like, it's okay if that sets off an alarm, and that alarm should sound like, let me make sure they're actually doing that. I think
Yeah. Yeah.
because that should sound off to
Let's
you.
verify that.
Yeah,
Yes.
that should sound off, and I'm
Yeah.
okay with you being a skeptic. You should. If someone's like eating 8 times body weight, 10 times body weight, not losing any weight. By the way, times body weight, super rough back of the envelope math.
Right.
Not,
They're ranges, though.
yeah.
Yeah.
You should be like, okay, let me go through and make sure they're doing as close to within a reasonable deviation of what they say they're doing. But after that, like, if I could take away the emotion, I just dealt with the client, how they feel, what the data is telling me, I'll see a lot more success.
Love it, man. We're going to leave it at that because I think people need to hear that message. It's like you said, X is different for everyone. Don't compare yourself to others. Don't use the static calculators and assume that's you. Like, you've got to get this awareness. And as we've talked on this show, you've got to track, you've got to measure and go from there and make decisions. All right. Where, Jordan, can listeners find more about you and your work?
Yeah, I hang out on Instagram, Jordan Lips Fitness. I also podcast where optimal meets practical. I'm guessing similar host of guests. I have a YouTube where you could watch them as well, and has 1,000 form videos if that's something you're interested in. But yeah, if you have a question, shoot me a message on Instagram. I'm not too hot shit to answer. I'll answer.
True, man. You're super responsive. So I'll throw all those in there, all the links as usual. Man, this was a blast. It was even better than expected. I knew it was going to be good, but you covered a lot of great stuff today. So thanks so much for coming on. It was a lot of fun.
Thanks, man. I appreciate it.